各位观众，大家好，我是卡拉，欢迎收看《美国观察》。议长佩洛西开始亚洲之行，但是没有提及是否会在台湾停留。曾经访台的前议长金里奇接受美国之音专访，解释了为什么他认为佩洛西必须访台。今天的节目中，我们共同关注。美国国会众议院议长办公室确认，佩洛西议长周日开始亚洲之行，访问新加坡、马来西亚、韩国和日本，但是没有提到是否在台湾停留。佩洛西此行将聚焦印太地区的共同安全、经济伙伴关系及民主治理。佩洛西议长没有确认他是否访问台湾。他的亚洲之行原本安排在今年4月，后来因为感染新冠病毒而推迟行程。前不久，《金融时报》披露，佩洛西今年8月的亚洲之行中将包括访问台湾，引发中国的不满。上周，拜登总统与中国国家主席习近平通电话，拜登告诉习近平，美国对台政策没有改变，华盛顿强烈反对单方面改变台海现状或损害和平与稳定的努力。习近平警告说，华盛顿应该遵守一个中国原则，并称玩火者必自焚。拜习通话之后，台湾外交部表示，台湾将继续深化与美国的安全伙伴关系。拜登总统在解除隔离的3天之后，于星期六再一次对新冠病毒检测呈阳性，这是抗病毒药物治疗之后罕见的反弹病例。白宫医生奥康纳星期日说，拜登总统继续感觉十分良好。他说，前一天发现总统重现阳性之后，继续进行日常检测，严格执行隔离。白宫宣布，拜登总统取消了周日返回特拉华家中以及周二访问密西根州的计划。79岁的拜登总统之前接受了帕克洛维德抗病毒药物治疗，并在星期2和星期3对新冠检测呈阴性。他随后解除隔离，并在室内佩戴口罩。中国长征5B 火箭星期六落回地球，美国航空航天局批评北京方面没有分享碎片可能落在哪里所需的具体轨迹信息。美国太空司令部说，长征5B 火箭于美国东部时间周六下午12点45分重新进入印度洋上空。美国国家航空航天局局长纳尔逊批评中国没有分享火箭坠落的细节。他指出，所有的国家都应该尽量分享这类信息，以准确地预测潜在的碎片撞击风险。美国前国会众议院议长金里奇是美中建交之后访问过台湾的最高级别美国官员。1997年，他不顾中共的威胁，坚持将台湾加入访问行程。几天之前，在与美国之音的专访中，他回顾了坚持访台的决定，分析了曾经对中国政策和领导人的误判。同时，他也认为美国不能对中共示弱，议长佩洛西访台势在必行。
So first of all, Mr. Speaker, how do you weigh the pros and cons of Speaker Pelosi's potential trip to Taiwan? Do you think she should go?
Well, I think now that it has become public, she has to go. And I think to back down before the Chinese communist dictatorship would send signals of weakness, would actually embolden Beijing to be more aggressive, and would make it look like America can be shoved around. You can have one conversation before this became public, although I am the highest ranking American ever to have gone to Taiwan. And I did so in a very direct disagreement with the Beijing government, which nonetheless invited me to come and give speeches in both Shanghai and Beijing with only the requirement that I had to go through Japan to get to Taiwan, that I couldn't fly direct. So I think this is at one level a lot of noise about nothing. I think if she holds her ground, and if the Biden administration doesn't act timidly and almost cowardly, I think everything will be fine. She'll go and be a nice event. Hope she takes a bipartisan delegation, and I saw a note this morning that she'd asked some Republicans to go with her. And I think that's a good signal of our support for Taiwan not being occupied or invaded by the People's Republic.
As you mentioned, that when the CCP threatened to withdraw your invitation in 1997, you insisted on going to Taiwan. But now China is a very different country now. Do you think your trip is still a good reference for Speaker Pelosi?
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, when they got when we said that we were going to go to Taiwan, and they said, you can't go to Taiwan. And Gardner Peckham, who was my national security advisor, said very clearly to them that the Chinese dictatorship does not instruct the American speaker on his travel schedule. And they came back and were tougher. We said, fine, if we have to choose between Beijing and Taipei, we're going to skip Beijing. So, if you're that mad, we won't come. At which point they promptly reversed themselves and said, no, we want you to come. And then they allowed me to give two very tough speeches about freedom and democracy and the rule of law, speeches which were pretty deviant from the way the dictatorship is run. The only concession they requested was that we couldn't fly direct from the People's Republic to Taiwan. China is in some ways different and not different. China has been a Leninist dictatorship since the Chinese Communist Party took over. Mao and the key leaders all were Leninists. They believe in a centralized hierarchical dictatorship with secret police and with basically as much thought control as they can get over every individual. It's a truly totalitarian system. It was back then, it is now.
But are you concerned about China taking some aggressive measures in response to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan? Because I'm sure you remembered the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996 is just 1 year before your visit to China and Taiwan. And back then, President Clinton responded by sending 2 aircraft carriers to the region. Are you concerned of China doing something now, and how should U.S. respond?
Well, I mean, the Chinese communists in 1996 were making threatening noises and were, I think, at the time, firing missiles and whatever. I was very publicly supportive of President Clinton sending the 2 aircraft carriers. I'm old enough. I remember the bombardment of Quemoy and Matsu in 1958. And I remember Eisenhower sending ships with nuclear weapons to stand off of China to say, we're not going to tolerate you invading these 2 islands. You have a totalitarian dictatorship with a very deep sense that it ought to be the central kingdom as it was before 1800. And they're going to push as hard as they can on every front. And that's not illegitimate. I mean, it's their right to try to do that. Our job is to make sure that they confront countervailing strength so that they understand that there are limits to what they can get away with. And part of that's just purely psychological. And that's what we were doing in 1996 and 1997. And I was there to say, look, we really believe in freedom. We really believe in the rule of law. We are really prepared to, on the one hand, Taiwan cannot declare its own independence. On the other hand, you cannot occupy Taiwan. And I was very clear in meetings with the most senior Chinese leadership. Admiral Jim Stavridis has pointed out that you could turn Taiwan into a porcupine. You could equip it with so many different defensive weapons that the cost of trying to take it would be so prohibitive that the Chinese just wouldn't try. Had we done that 2 years ago with Ukraine, there would never have been a Russian attack because it would have been too expensive. And I think that's the real lesson we should learn from the disaster in Ukraine.
Policy-wise, right? Do you think it's time now to update U.S. policy towards Taiwan? Because for the past 40 years, strategic ambiguity has effectively avoided war and enabled the U.S. to uphold relations with Taiwan while also develop ties with China. Do you think now is the time to update on that and take a more clear stance?
Well, I think we should. And it's very important to make clear that no military effort by the Chinese dictatorship will be tolerated. And that whatever it takes to defeat that military effort would happen. Remember, I mean, Taiwan produces something like 68% of the more advanced chips in the world. I mean, if Taiwan were for some reason knocked out economically, the impact worldwide, we think we have a supply chain problem now. You take Taiwan out of the chip manufacturing business, you have a worldwide crisis in virtually every modern system.
How do you evaluate on this one China policy? Do you think it served its purpose? And is it now the time for the US to recognize Taiwan's status?
Well, what I really think happened was tragic, is that when Hong Kong was given back to China by Britain, there was hope, and they talked about, two systems in one country. And there was a hope that if they could allow Hong Kong to remain truly free, that would then become a model by which you could then have Taiwan also become, three systems in one country. Problem is that the dictatorship cannot stand any zone of freedom. And so they have actually crushed the traditional openness of Hong Kong in ways that have both been economically very expensive and have shattered the traditional culture of Hong Kong. And so I think what you have now is a situation where why would anybody, the 24 million people living on Taiwan who are prosperous, who are remarkably free, who have real elections, who have a genuine open news media, who can travel all over the world, why would they want to have a Beijing-dominated secret police totalitarian state ruin their lives the way they've ruined Hong Kong? And that's the biggest difference. In '96, we had two hopes that turned out to be false. And Claire Christensen and I wrote a book called Trump versus China, where we went into this at some length, because I was one of the people who thought that the opening up of markets was the first step towards freedom. And I was just wrong. I actually, it's a bad sign probably about my education, but I actually did not realize that Deng Xiaoping was one of the first 23 founders of the Chinese Communist Party when he was actually in Paris during World War I. Went back to China through Moscow, spent a year at Lenin University, was a deeply committed Leninist. So when Deng Xiaoping makes the Great Southern Tour, which I've always thought was one of the most important events of the last 50 years, and gives these speeches that we have to be open to productivity, that I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat, I care if it catches the rat, etc. Like most of our elites, I joined in thinking this is the beginning of opening up. Well, it was a profound misunderstanding. What he was actually saying was, we can only keep the dictatorship if we can provide enough prosperity that people don't throw us out. So it was a pro-dictatorship survival, not a modify the dictatorship, which is why Deng Xiaoping is one of the real hardliners at Tiananmen Square, demanding that they kill people. So that's the context. In '96, in '97, we were still in a place where we thought there was a genuine possibility that you would see the emergence of a moderate rule of law integrated in the world order Chinese system. I think now we all know that's not going to happen in the foreseeable future, that what you have is a totalitarian state. And remember, when Khrushchev makes his famous secret speech attacking Stalin, the reaction in Beijing is horrified, because they see Khrushchev as the equivalent of Martin Luther launching the Protestant Reformation. They don't think this is a great idea. They love Stalin. They still love Stalin. Xi Jinping is much closer to Stalin and Lenin than he is to George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And so I think we have to take a position. I don't want us to deliberately provoke the Chinese communists, and I think to suggest that Taiwan be admitted to the UN, that the United States will establish a full embassy, et cetera. I think that would push us dangerously close to a genuine confrontation. On the other hand, I do not think an American speaker visiting the island will be anything more than an irritation.
Okay. Speaking of now, Xi Jinping is set to be re-elected for an unprecedented third term later this year. And as you know, that so-called reuniting Taiwan with China is one of his major political goals. And how do you think he will change the dynamics between US, China, and Taiwan?
Well, I think that he is probably very frustrated right now. COVID has been much more damaging to China than they want to admit. Their economy is really slowed down to a degree we haven't seen in 30 years. The unhappiness in the middle class and in rural China is much greater than it has been for a generation. And he's watching all of his neighbors gradually organize against him. I mean, the Chinese are a lot like the Chinese communists, are a lot like the Wilhelmine Germans in the late 19th century. They behave in ways that guarantee that everybody else gets irritated. And so I think what he's facing is that the great gamble that they could become the dominant country in the world is probably going to fail. And in fact, as you know, they're on the edge of a demographic cliff that is unbelievable. There may be as few as 400 million Chinese at the end of the century, because the impact of the one-child policy is so devastating that they're going to have a very, after 2050, they have a very limited workforce. They have a very, very big social burden of sort of retired people. As somebody once said, the Japanese were clever enough to get rich before they got old. The Chinese are about to get old before they got rich. And I think this means that Xi Jinping has a very short time horizon to have any hope of breaking free. And that as we just saw with a speech by the leading general in Taipei to a conference in Australia, you have this network building of virtually everybody who doesn't want China to dominate. And I think that's probably been a surprise to the Chinese how rapidly that's come together.
And what would your recommendation or advice be for the Biden administration to better deter China?
Rebuild the American military very dramatically. Make sure that you can dominate in space. Prepare to survive an electronic magnetic pulse attack, and prepare to dominate in cyber warfare. I mean, you first have to have the tools. It's not about dancing diplomatically. It's about having the sheer strength that by any reasonable standard, the Chinese dictatorship will decide that it is impossible to take us on.
What do you think the U.S. could do more to better defend Taiwan's democracy?
Well, I would say two things. I'd say, first of all, we should ensure that they have all of the sophisticated defensive weapons they need on such a scale that it would be practically impossible for the Chinese communists to invade them. And that's not that hard to do. And Admiral Stavridis, the four-star admiral who was the head of NATO, has written extensively on this. And I think it basically talks about turning them into a porcupine so that they're just too hard to swallow. But the other thing we ought to do is we ought to remember, we need, just as we had with the Soviets, we need a radio-free China. We need a communication. We need to communicate that we are not opposed to the Chinese people. The Chinese people have every right to pursue happiness. They have every right to be productive. They have every right to live in prosperity and in safety. Our problems are with the totalitarian dictatorship. And I think we should have a much more robust outreach from programs like yours to make sure that we are communicating with the people of China, that there is a natural affinity between the American people and the Chinese people, and we should not let problems between our governments be confused into problems between our two peoples.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for taking my interview.
欢迎继续收看《美国观察》。刚刚在节目中，我们看到美国前议长，也是曾经访问过台湾的最高级别美国官员金里奇，解释了为什么他认为佩洛西必须访台。金里奇是历史学家出身，1979年进入联邦众议院，1995年至1999年担任众议院议长。作为一名共和党人，他在美国政治中扮演着重要的角色。他也对当今的美中关系有深刻的研究。下面我们来连线美国之音记者方正，了解更多的情况。欢迎方正。
卡拉好。
方总，我想在刚才的采访中，你也听到了这个前议长金里奇啊，他在采访中说到台湾问题的时候，说到美中关系的时候，是引用了很多的历史事件。当然，这也和他这个历史学家的出身是有非常紧密的关系的。而且他看这些政治事件，看这些时事，也是带着一个有历史纵深的这样一个视角。那么，能不能给我们介绍一下他在从政之后对于美国政治的影响有多大？
金里奇应该说是在美国当代政治上，影响非常大的一位人物。他是众议院议长里头不多的几位有博士学位的。他是在新奥尔良的 Tulane University 拿到的历史学博士，然后他在佐治亚州的一个大学里当过几年历史学的教授。从你刚才跟他的这场非常有质量的采访里头，我们也都能听到他谈到当下问题的时候，历史纵深感的这种感觉是非常强的。纵横捭阖、旁征博引，在这个短短的十几分钟时间里头都能够表现出来。那他成为议长的时候呢，是94年，是共和党在时隔40多年以后第一次夺回了众议院的多数席位。那他提出来的一个概念，对共和党当年中期选举的胜利，这是克林顿总统第一任期的中期选举。那金里奇的领导能力，他的理念，他历史学家的这种观点，这种对事情的比较深入的阐释，应该说帮助共和党历史性的夺得了50多个席位。民主党当年是大败，他也一直成为了这个众议院的议长，然后连续干了几个任期。他当时提出了一个概念叫 contract with America， 就是与美国签约。他是鉴于国会推行议程可能不是特别有利，他就提出来说，我们共和党人在新一届的国会里头，我们要做10件事。这10件事希望在新一届国会开始以后的100天内能够实现。他基本上deliver了，就是说他提出来的这些主要的议程，包括福利制度的改革，包括减税、平衡预算，包括限制美国军事力量参与联合国的没有太多必要的那些维和行动，他10项任务基本上都能实现。他也在当年1995年被评为了《时代》杂志的风云人物，这说明他当时影响力是非常非常的大的。但从另外一个方面来说，他的对手在白宫的是克林顿总统，他们俩基本上是一个年代的人。金里奇是1943年出生的，克林顿是1946年出生的。克林顿当然也是一个政治天才。就针对金里奇的这个 contract with America 与美国签约，克林顿改了一个字，就调侃金里奇，消解掉了金里奇的很多这种光环。克林顿说，金里奇的 contract with America 其实是 contract on America， 你与美国签约实际上是让美国逼着美国跟你签了合同，是这个意思。克林顿当然是非常聪明的。两人的争斗几次导致了联邦政府的关门，因为金里奇作为议长，手头对于联邦预算的通过有至关重要的权利。那到了99年，他下台的时候，离开众议院议长的位置以后呢，他仍然在政坛是非常非常的活跃。12年，他曾经角逐过共和党的总统提名人，虽然没有能够赢下来，当年的提名人是罗姆尼嘛，但是他排名是很前的。16年特朗普竞选总统的时候，金里奇是进了最后的副总统人选的名单，是很认真的被当时的共和党提名人特朗普考虑过作为自己的竞选搭档的。他的智库，他在研究界一直都非常活跃，这是一个非常聪明、非常有影响力的共和党人。
是，而且我们看到这个金里奇议长，他也是对美中关系有着非常深入的了解。就像刚才这个采访中，他就提到了自己写的一本书，叫做《Trump vs. China》，应该是叫特朗普对阵中国。那么显然，他对于美国应该如何应对中国的挑战，也是有着一个系统性的思考的。我知道，方正你读过这本书，能不能跟我们介绍一下，他是具体怎么看待中国的威胁的？
在金里奇议长跟你的采访里头，他也提到了自己的教育让他对中国的认识是有偏差的。 他在这本书里呢，也回顾了自己对中国的认识。他比方说由赛珍珠 Pearl Buck 这个年代，就是20世纪早期美国对中国的了解开始说起。他说这些人其实是有一种很虔诚、很天真的、很浪漫化的传教士情节。Pearl Buck 赛珍珠，他是出生在一个牧师家庭的，他的父亲是一个传教士，在中国。Pearl Buck 自己在中国是一直长到成年，精通中文。他后来得到了普利策文学奖得过的2，他后来也得到了诺贝尔文学奖。他代表的是一种什么？就是说，他们热爱中国，热爱中国文化，但是知道中国民众的疾苦，知道中国的积贫积弱。他们认为美国有道义责任帮助中国，美国也有可能实质上给予中国帮助。那这个血脉、这个传统、这个基因一直延续到了很多年，中间经过了很大的跨度，包括费正清这些人，包括尼克松访华，一直到最后需要调整，意识到中国是美国威胁的时候，是这本书里提到的。金里奇议长是把很大的功劳归功给了特朗普担任总统的4年。他说，只有在这4年，美国才最终意识到，中国是美国历史上的第5大挑战。金里奇把中共的威胁上升到了一个历史性的高度。美国的5大挑战按时间顺序是由美国独立战争到19世纪中期的内战，到2战针对纳粹德国，到冷战针对苏联，现在是第5次。金里奇认为，中共对美国的价值、对美国的理念的威胁超过了纳粹德国和苏联。这是他看待中国威胁的历史高度。
是，另外我也知道他在书中是用下棋来给这个美中竞争来做了一个类比啊，就是他分别是使用了这个围棋和国际象棋的这样一个来进行类比。那么他说，美国擅长的呢可能是国际象棋式的这样比较正面的这样一个竞争战场拼杀，但是中国的战略呢则是更多有围棋的特点，比较看重布局。能不能给我们介绍一下这方面的具体的情况？
这是他这个书里头，金里奇在自己书里头提到的一个很有趣的细节。将中国的战略，比如说围棋，并不是金里奇的首创。基辛格在之前说过，美国其他的一些研究美中关系的学者也提出过，就是要关注中国的战略，很像中国人发明的、中国人历史上挺爱玩的挺好的围棋。什么意思？就是说，它不在于像国际象棋一样这么剧烈的冲突，以消灭对方的有生力量为主。美国特别擅长在战场上打败所有敌人的这么一种战略。他觉得中国更在于扩大影响，占领 territory， 就是一片一片的地，但是并不一定总是有针锋相对的冲突，并不是有战场上的决斗。他举了2个例子，一个是中国在南海这种发展，比方说占据珊瑚礁，逐渐扩大影响，并不一定和周边国家有硬性的冲突，但是先由容纳渔民开始，然后建机场、安装雷达，把它军事化，这样把领地影响逐渐扩大。一带一路呢是另外一个例子。金里奇就是为了了解围棋到底是怎么回事，他甚至找了美国围棋协会的一些大师们，还有当时在美国围棋会访问的中国的一个围棋大师，到金里奇自己的办公室去教大家下围棋，这样大家加强对中国这种战略的理解。
是，的确是一个很有意思的类比。非常感谢方正参加今天的节目，给我们带来的详细解读。
谢谢卡拉。
那以上就是今天美国观察的全部内容，感谢您收看今天的节目，我们明天再见。